There are moments in history when evil reveals itself so completely, so methodically, that it shatters our understanding of what humans are capable of. December 1999, Lahore, Pakistan. The city was preparing for the new millennium, for celebrations, for hope. But in the offices of the Daily Jang, one of Pakistan's largest Urdu newspapers, an envelope arrived that would change everything. Inside was a letter, 4 pages, handwritten, meticulous. The editor who opened it that morning probably expected another complaint, another political rant, maybe even a love confession. What he got instead was something far more sinister. The letter began simply, almost matter-of-factly. I am Javed Iqbal, son of Mohammed Iqbal. I am writing to confess that I have murdered 100 children. 100 children. The number was so staggering, so incomprehensible that the first reaction was disbelief. This had to be a hoax, some sick joke, a deranged fantasy. But as the editor continued reading, his hands started to shake. The letter didn't just claim responsibility. It described everything. The methods, the locations, the timeline. It included names, ages, details that only someone who had actually done these things could know. Javed Iqbal wrote that his victims were all boys, aged 6 to 16. He explained that he had strangled them with a chain, one by one, over the course of 6 months. He described how he had dismembered their bodies and dissolved them in vats of hydrochloric acid until nothing remained. No bones, no flesh, no evidence. Just liquid that he poured into the sewers of Lahore, washing away any trace of these children as if they had never existed. But that wasn't all. Enclosed with the letter were photographs, 100 photographs. Each one showed a different boy, and beneath each photo was a name and an age. Javed Iqbal had documented everything. He had kept meticulous records of his crimes like some grotesque accountant tallying inventory. And at the end of his confession, he wrote something that would haunt investigators for years to come. He said he had no regrets. He said he would have continued if circumstances hadn't forced him to stop, and then he explained why he did it. According to his letter, Javed Iqbal claimed that his mother had died while he was in prison on false charges. False charges of sodomy, charges that had humiliated him, destroyed his reputation, torn apart his life. He blamed the police. He blamed society. And he decided that the only way to make people understand his pain was to inflict pain on others. So he targeted the most vulnerable, the most invisible members of Pakistani society. Street children. Boys who had no homes, no families, no one to look for them when they disappeared. Boys who society had already abandoned. The letter ended with a chilling statement. Javed Iqbal wrote that he was sending this confession because he wanted to be punished in the same way he had punished his victims. He wanted to be strangled. He wanted his body cut into 100 pieces. He wanted to be dissolved in acid. He was demanding his own execution, dictating the terms of his punishment before he had even been caught. And then, just to make sure the police knew he wasn't bluffing, he included his address. A house on Ravi Road in Lahore's Shadbagh neighborhood. When the newspaper contacted the police, there was immediate skepticism. Pakistan had seen its share of violent crime, but nothing on this scale. 100 victims. That would make this not just the worst case in Pakistan's history, but one of the worst serial killer cases in the world. The police chief initially thought it might be an attempt to create panic or gain attention, but they couldn't ignore it. They had to investigate. On December 2, 1999, a team of officers arrived at the address Javed Iqbal had provided. It was an ordinary-looking house in a middle-class neighborhood. Nothing about it screamed danger or horror. The neighbors said the man who lived there was quiet, kept to himself, occasionally had young boys coming and going, but no one thought much of it. Lahore had thousands of street children. It wasn't unusual for them to run errands or do odd jobs for shopkeepers and homeowners. But when the police forced open the door and stepped inside, the smell hit them first. Acrid chemical burning their nostrils and throats, and underneath that, something organic and rotten, something dead. The house was modest, a few rooms, sparsely furnished, but what the police found inside would be seared into their memories forever. In the main room, there were two large blue plastic vats, industrial-sized containers, the kind used for water storage. Both were filled with a dark, viscous liquid. When officers looked closer, they saw what appeared to be partially dissolved organic matter floating in the acid. Hair, fragments of clothing, things that might have been bone but had been eaten away until they were barely recognizable. The stench was overwhelming. Several officers had to run outside to vomit. On the walls there were bloodstains, dark brown patches that someone had tried to scrub away but hadn't quite managed to remove completely. In one corner there were chains, heavy iron chains with rust and what looked like blood on them, and scattered throughout the house on tables and shelves and pinned to walls were photographs, dozens and dozens of photographs of young boys. Some were smiling, unaware of what was about to happen to them. Others looked frightened, confused. And each photograph had a name written underneath in careful handwriting. Ahmed, age 8, Bilal, age 10, Shahid, age 12, on and on and on. The police found notebooks too, ledgers where Javed Iqbal had recorded every single murder. The date, the victim's name, their age, how long it took them to die. He had kept records like he was running a business. There were sketches and diagrams showing how he dismembered the bodies. There were receipts for the purchase of hydrochloric acid, gallons and gallons of it bought over several months from different chemical suppliers so as not to raise suspicion. And then there was the clothing, garbage bags filled with children's clothes, torn shirts, small shoes, pants with stains on them. Each item represented a life that had been extinguished. The forensic team estimated that there was enough evidence in that house to support claims of at least 80 to 100 murders. This wasn't a hoax. This wasn't someone seeking attention. This was real. Javed Iqbal had actually done it. He had murdered 100 children and dissolved their bodies in acid. But Javed Iqbal himself was nowhere to be found. Despite giving the police his address, despite practically inviting them to arrest him, he had vanished. And now Pakistan faced the largest manhunt in its history. Every police officer in Lahore was mobilized. Checkpoints were set up on every major road. Photographs of Javed Iqbal were distributed to border crossings, train stations, bus terminals. The media went into a frenzy. This was the only story that mattered. Television channels ran continuous coverage. Newspapers printed special editions. And in homes across Pakistan, parents held their children a little tighter and wondered how something like this could happen. To understand how Javed Iqbal became the Monster of Lahore, we have to go back to the beginning. He was born in 1961 in Lahore to a middle-class family. His father, Mohammed Iqbal, was a businessman, and Javed grew up in relative comfort. By all accounts, his childhood was unremarkable. He attended school, though he wasn't a particularly good student. He was described by neighbors as a quiet, introverted boy who kept to himself. As an adult, Javed Iqbal tried his hand at various businesses. He ran a small gym at one point. He dealt in real estate. He operated a video game shop. None of these ventures were particularly successful, but they allowed him to maintain a modest lifestyle. He never married. He had no children of his own. He lived alone in the house on Ravi Road that his father had left him. But there were incidents. Dark incidents that in hindsight should have raised red flags. In 1985, Javed Iqbal was arrested on charges of sodomy. A family accused him of SA on their son. The case went to court, but Iqbal was released due to lack of evidence. The family claimed they had been pressured to drop the charges. Then in 1990, another similar accusation. Again, Iqbal was arrested. Again, he was released. This time, he spent several months in jail before the charges were dismissed. It was this second arrest that, according to Iqbal's own confession, became the catalyst for his killing spree. He claimed that his time in prison was humiliating. He was mocked by other inmates. He was labeled a predator. His reputation in the community was destroyed. And while he was locked up, his mother fell ill. She died before he was released. Iqbal blamed the police for his mother's death. He blamed the legal system. He blamed everyone except himself. After his release, something changed in Javed Iqbal. Neighbors noticed that he became even more reclusive. He stopped trying to run businesses. He stopped socializing. Instead, he seemed to develop an obsession with street children. He would spend hours walking through Lahore's bazaars and slums, watching the boys who lived on the streets, and he started to plan. Street children in Pakistan are among the most vulnerable populations in the world. In the late 1990s, estimates suggested there were over 1.5 million street children in Pakistan, with thousands in Lahore alone. These were boys and girls who had run away from abusive homes, or whose families were too poor to feed them, or who had been orphaned and had nowhere else to go. They slept in alleys and under bridges. They begged for money. They worked as shoe shiners or tea boys, or did whatever odd jobs they could find just to survive another day. Society treated them as invisible. They were a nuisance, a reminder of poverty that people wanted to ignore. If a street child disappeared, who would notice? Who would report them missing? Often there was no one. No parent to file a police report. No teacher to wonder why they didn't show up to school. They simply vanished, and the world continued as if they had never existed. Javed Iqbal understood this. He understood that these children were the perfect victims because no one cared about them. No one would look for them. He could kill them, and no one would even know they were gone. His method was calculated and methodical. He would approach boys in the crowded areas of Lahore, places like the Badami Bagh bus terminal or the narrow lanes of the old city where street children congregated. He would strike up conversations, offering them food or tea. He would tell them he needed help with work at his house, that he would pay them, give them a place to stay for the night. For boys who were hungry, who were desperate, who had learned to take whatever help they could get, the offer was irresistible. Javed Iqbal's house became a trap. Once a boy was inside, the door would close and Iqbal would reveal his true intentions. He would essay the children first. Then, to ensure they couldn't identify him, couldn't report him, couldn't escape, he would strangle them with a chain. Some of the boys died quickly. Others struggled for minutes, their small hands clawing at the chain around their necks as Iqbal tightened it with mechanical precision. After they were dead, Iqbal would photograph them. Then he would dismember the bodies using knives and saws he kept for this purpose. The pieces would go into the vats of hydrochloric acid. The acid would dissolve flesh and bone over the course of several days until there was nothing left but a dark sludge. This sludge would be poured into the sewer system. It would flow into the Ravi River that ran through Lahore, mixing with industrial waste and sewage, until any traces of DNA or human remains were completely obliterated. Between July and December of 1999, Javed Iqbal killed 100 boys. That's roughly one child every 2 days. It's a pace that seems almost impossible, but Iqbal had perfected his system. He knew how long the acid took to dissolve a body. He knew when to go hunting for new victims. He kept his records meticulously, crossing off names in his ledger like a shopkeeper tracking inventory. The boys had names. They had lives, however brief and difficult those lives had been. There was Ali, who was 9 years old and sold newspapers at the train station. There was Hassan, who was 12 and worked as a tea boy in a roadside cafe. There was Imran, who was 7 and begged outside a mosque. Their families, if they had any, assumed the boys had just moved to another part of the city or had found work somewhere or had met with an accident. It never occurred to them that someone was systematically hunting and murdering street children. But Javed Iqbal didn't work alone. As his killing spree continued, he recruited accomplices, or perhaps recruited is the wrong word. He created them. 3 boys, all of them street children themselves, all of them victims who became perpetrators through a cycle of abuse so horrific it's almost beyond comprehension. The first was Sajid Ahmed, who was 17 years old. Sajid had been living on the streets for years after running away from an abusive father. He was one of Iqbal's early victims, but instead of killing him, Iqbal kept him alive. He told Sajid that if he helped lure other boys to the house, if he helped with the murders, then Iqbal would let him live. He would have food, shelter, protection. Sajid, traumatized and terrified and desperate to survive, agreed. The second accomplice was Mohammed Nadim, who was 15. Like Sajid, he had been a street child, homeless and vulnerable. Iqbal had picked him up with the promise of work, had essayed him, and then instead of killing him, had made him an offer. Help me or die like the others. Nadim chose to live. The third was Mohammed Sabir, who was only 13 years old. He was the youngest of the accomplices, still a child himself. He had watched Iqbal murder other boys. He had been forced to help clean up the blood, to dismember bodies, to pour the remains into the acid vats. The trauma had broken something inside him. He stopped resisting. He did what he was told because the alternative was death. These three boys became Iqbal's helpers. They would go out into the streets and befriend other children who trusted them because they were peers. They would bring these children back to the house on Ravi Road, and then they would watch, or sometimes participate, as Iqbal murdered them. It's a pattern seen in other serial killer cases, where victims are manipulated or coerced into becoming accomplices. But that doesn't make it any less horrifying. These were children who had been so thoroughly traumatized and controlled that they helped their abuser kill others just like them. For 6 months this continued. 6 months of murder and disposal and hunting for new victims, and somehow, incredibly, no one noticed. The police weren't looking for a serial killer because they didn't know one existed. The families of the victims weren't reporting them missing because most of these boys had no families to speak of. The neighbors on Ravi Road didn't suspect anything because Iqbal was careful. He soundproofed rooms. He cleaned up evidence. He maintained a facade of normalcy. But by December 1999, something changed. Maybe Iqbal felt the net closing in. Maybe one of his accomplices had tried to escape or threatened to go to the police. Maybe he simply decided that his work was done. Whatever the reason, he made a decision that no one could fully understand. He wrote the confession letter. He documented everything. And then he disappeared. The manhunt that followed was unprecedented in Pakistan's history. Javed Iqbal's face was plastered on every television screen, every newspaper, every wanted poster. The police organized search parties that combed through Lahore's streets, checking every known hideout for criminals, every cheap hotel, every abandoned building. They interviewed hundreds of people. They followed up on thousands of tips from the public, most of which led nowhere. Meanwhile, the discovery of the house on Ravi Road had unleashed a wave of panic across Lahore. Parents who had dismissed their missing sons as runaways suddenly wondered if they had been victims. Families began showing up at police stations with photographs, asking if their children were among the 100 that Iqbal had documented. It was a heartbreaking process. Officers would lay out the photographs that had been recovered from Iqbal's house, and parents would scan through them, praying they wouldn't see their child's face, but needing to know. Some parents did find their children in those photographs. A mother recognized her 10-year-old son who had disappeared 8 months earlier. She had thought he had gone to another city to find work. A father identified his 14-year-old, a boy he had kicked out of the house after an argument, thinking he would come back after a few days. He never did. The grief in that police station was suffocating. These parents were being told that their children hadn't just died. They had been tortured, murdered, and dissolved in acid. There would be no bodies to bury, no graves to visit, no closure. The public outrage was immense. How had this been allowed to happen? How had 100 children disappeared without anyone noticing? The police were criticized for their inaction, for not taking the issue of missing street children seriously. Child welfare organizations pointed out that they had been warning about the vulnerability of street children for years, but no one had listened. Politicians made speeches about law and order, about protecting the innocent, but it all felt hollow in the face of such monumental failure. And through all of this, Javed Iqbal remained at large. Days turned into weeks. There were reported sightings in different cities. Someone claimed to have seen him in Karachi. Another report placed him in Peshawar. The police chased every lead, but Iqbal seemed to have vanished into thin air. Some speculated that he had fled to Afghanistan or Iran. Others thought he might have committed suicide, unable to live with what he had done. But those who knew the case, who had read his confession letter carefully, didn't think so. Javed Iqbal wanted to be caught. He wanted to face trial. He wanted the spectacle of his own punishment. And then, on December 30th, 1999, just as the country was preparing to celebrate the new millennium, Javed Iqbal walked into the offices of the Daily Jang in Lahore and surrendered. He was accompanied by one of his accomplices, Sajid Ahmed. He told the shocked newspaper staff that he was ready to confess everything to the police. He wanted to tell his story. He wanted the world to know what he had done and why. The police were called, and within minutes the building was surrounded. Javed Iqbal was arrested without incident. He was calm, almost serene. When officers handcuffed him and led him to a police vehicle, a crowd had already gathered. Word had spread that the Monster of Lahore had been caught. People screamed at him, calling him a demon, a devil. Someone threw a shoe, an ultimate sign of disrespect in Pakistani culture. But Iqbal seemed unfazed. He had gotten what he wanted. The attention, the notoriety, the platform to justify his actions. At the police station, Javed Iqbal gave a full confession. He described his methods in chilling detail. He explained how he selected his victims, how he lured them, how he killed them, how he disposed of their bodies. He showed no remorse. In fact, he seemed almost proud. He told investigators that he had done what he set out to do, which was to make people feel the pain he had felt when his mother died. He said that every child he killed was revenge against a society that had humiliated him, imprisoned him falsely, and robbed him of his dignity. The confession was videotaped. Javed Iqbal sat in a chair, speaking directly to the camera with a calm, measured tone. He talked about his victims not as human beings but as numbers, as means to an end. He said he felt no guilt because, in his mind, he had been wronged first. The logic was twisted, sociopathic, completely devoid of empathy. Psychologists who later analyzed the tape noted that Iqbal displayed classic signs of antisocial personality disorder. He had no capacity for remorse, no ability to see his victims as people deserving of life and dignity. The accomplices, Sajid, Nadim, and Sabir, were also arrested. Their confessions painted a picture of life inside Iqbal's house that was even more disturbing than anyone had imagined. They described how Iqbal would sometimes keep victims alive for days, essay them repeatedly before finally killing them. They talked about how he forced them to watch the murders, to participate, to become complicit in his crimes, so they couldn't turn him in without incriminating themselves. They were victims and perpetrators simultaneously, trapped in a nightmare with no escape. The trial of Javed Iqbal began in early 2000, and it became a media spectacle. The courtroom was packed every day with journalists, human rights activists, and family members of the victims. Security was intense because there were credible threats that someone would try to kill Iqbal before the trial concluded. The judge, Ali Baksh Rania, presided over a case unlike any he had handled before. How do you prosecute someone for 100 murders? How do you deliver justice when the crimes are so heinous that no punishment seems adequate? The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. They had Iqbal's confession, both written and videotaped. They had the photographs with the names and ages of the victims. They had the vats of acid, the chains, the blood-stained walls, the ledgers documenting each murder. They had testimony from the accomplices. They even had families who identified their missing children from the photographs. The defense, for its part, had little to work with. Iqbal's lawyer tried to argue that his client was mentally unstable, that he couldn't be held fully responsible for his actions. But the premeditation, the meticulous planning, the careful documentation all argued against insanity. Midway through the trial, Javed Iqbal changed his story. He suddenly claimed that he had made everything up. He said the confession was false, that he had been trying to expose the plight of street children by creating a scandal. He said he had faked the evidence, that the photographs were of children who were still alive, that no one had actually been murdered. It was a bizarre turn that no one believed. The evidence was too concrete, too overwhelming. But it added another layer of manipulation to Iqbal's character. Even in court, facing the death penalty, he was trying to control the narrative. On March 16, 2000, Judge Alabaksh Rania delivered the verdict. Javed Iqbal was found guilty on 100 counts of murder. The sentence was unprecedented, shocking even those who had been following the case closely. The judge ruled that Iqbal would be executed by strangulation in front of the parents of his victims. His body would then be cut into 100 pieces, one for each child he had murdered. Those pieces would be dissolved in a vat of acid, the same way he had dissolved his victims. It was an eye for an eye justice taken to its most extreme interpretation. The judge also sentenced Iqbal to 700 years in prison, 7 years for each victim, though this was largely symbolic given the death sentence. He was fined the equivalent of about $10,000, again a symbolic gesture. The accomplices, Sajid, Nadim, and Sabir, were also found guilty and sentenced to death, though there was significant debate about whether they should be held as accountable as Iqbal given that they were minors and had been coerced. The sentence sparked international controversy. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, condemned it as cruel and unusual punishment. They argued that no matter how heinous the crime, torture and mutilation of the convicted went against basic human rights principles. The United Nations issued a statement expressing concern. Even within Pakistan, there was debate. Some people felt the sentence was justified, that Iqbal deserved to suffer the way his victims had suffered. Others argued that Pakistan's legal system should be better than the criminals it prosecuted, that descending to Iqbal's level of brutality made the state no better than him. Javed Iqbal was transferred to Kot Lakhpat jail in Lahore to await his execution. He was placed in a high-security cell, kept in isolation for his own protection. Other inmates had made it clear that they would kill him if given the chance. Even among criminals, there's a hierarchy of evil, and those who hurt children are at the bottom. But Iqbal would never face the execution that had been prescribed for him. On the morning of October 8, 2001, guards found Javed Iqbal dead in his cell. Sajid Ahmed, one of his accomplices who was being held in an adjacent cell, was also found dead. The official ruling was suicide. Authorities claimed that both men had ingested poison, likely smuggled into the jail somehow. Iqbal was found hanging from a rope made from his bed sheets, though the poison had apparently killed him before strangulation would have. Sajid was found in a similar state. But almost immediately, questions arose. How did they get poison in a maximum security prison? Why were there bruises on Iqbal's body that suggested he had been beaten shortly before his death? Why did the autopsy report show injuries inconsistent with suicide? Many people believed that Iqbal had been murdered by guards or other inmates, possibly with the tacit approval of authorities who knew that carrying out his official sentence would be legally and politically problematic. Some theorized that families of victims had paid to have him killed. Others suggested that corrupt officials wanted him dead to prevent him from revealing uncomfortable truths about how he had operated for so long without detection. No one claimed Javed Iqbal's body. His family, ashamed and horrified by his crimes, wanted nothing to do with him. He was buried in an unmarked grave in a section of the cemetery reserved for criminals and the destitute. There was no funeral, no mourners. In death, as in life, Javed Iqbal was alone. The other accomplices, Nadim and Sabir, had their death sentences commuted to life imprisonment, after appeals argued that they were minors and victims themselves. They remain in prison to this day, 2 more lives destroyed by Javed Iqbal's evil. The aftermath of the case reverberated through Pakistan for years. It exposed the vulnerability of street children in ways that could no longer be ignored. Child welfare organizations pushed for reforms. There were calls for better tracking of missing children, for more resources dedicated to getting street kids off the streets and into shelters and schools. Some changes were made. Lahore opened more shelters for homeless youth. Police began taking missing children reports more seriously, even when those children came from poor families or had no families at all. But the truth is that the underlying problems that made Iqbal's killing spree possible still exist. Pakistan still has millions of street children. They are still vulnerable. They still disappear, not always to serial killers, but to trafficking, to accidents, to disease, to violence. The case of Javed Iqbal should have been a wake-up call, but systemic change is slow and difficult, especially in a country with so many competing crises. For the families of the 100 victims, there was no closure. Most never recovered their children's bodies because there were no bodies to recover. They couldn't perform proper Islamic burials. They couldn't visit graves. All they had were memories, and for some, not even that. Some of the boys had been estranged from their families for so long that all they had were faded photographs and guilt over the last harsh words spoken or the decision to let their child leave home. One mother, whose 11-year-old son was identified in Iqbal's photographs, gave an interview years later. She said that she still sets a plate for her son at dinner sometimes, just for a moment forgetting that he's gone. She said that the worst part isn't the knowing he's dead, it's the imagining, the wondering what his last moments were like, whether he was scared, whether he called out for her, whether he suffered. These are questions that haunt the parents of Iqbal's victims, questions that will never have answers. The case also raised troubling questions about how Javed Iqbal was able to operate for so long. Were the earlier sodomy charges in 1985 and 1990 actually false as he claimed, or were they legitimate accusations that weren't properly prosecuted? If they were true, could these murders have been prevented if he had been properly convicted and monitored? Why didn't neighbors report the smell coming from his house, the constant stream of young boys going in but never coming out? Why didn't police investigate sooner when parents of street children tried to report them missing, only to be turned away because their children didn't matter? These questions speak to larger societal failures: the marginalization of the poor, the indifference toward vulnerable populations, the corruption and incompetence within law enforcement, the lack of mental health resources, the failure to take early warning signs seriously. Javed Iqbal was a monster, but he was a monster that society allowed to flourish through its own negligence and prejudice. From a psychological standpoint, Javed Iqbal remains a disturbing case study. Most serial killers try to hide their crimes, to evade capture for as long as possible, but Iqbal documented everything. He photographed his victims. He kept meticulous records, and then he turned himself in, practically demanding to be punished. Psychologists have debated his motivations. Some argue that he had a martyr complex, that he wanted to be seen as someone who had suffered great injustice and was therefore justified in his revenge. Others suggest he was simply a sadist who got as much pleasure from the infamy and attention as he did from the killings themselves. His claims about his mother's death being the catalyst for his crimes have been largely dismissed as rationalization. While it's true that his mother died around the time of his 1990 arrest, there's no evidence that her death was directly caused by his imprisonment. More likely, Iqbal was looking for an excuse, a narrative that would make his actions seem somehow justified or at least understandable. In reality, his choice to target vulnerable children suggests someone who was fundamentally cowardly. He didn't attack those who had actually wronged him, the police officers, the judges, the accusers. He attacked children who had nothing to do with his grievances because they were easy targets. The legacy of Javed Iqbal is a dark stain on Pakistan's history. He remains the worst serial killer in the country's history and one of the most prolific serial killers in world history. His case is studied in criminology courses, analyzed in academic papers, and featured in documentaries. A film about his crimes was released in 2022, though it sparked controversy and calls for censorship from those who felt it sensationalized the murders. But beyond the statistics, beyond the infamy, there are 100 children who never got to grow up. Boys who might have become fathers, husbands, teachers, shopkeepers, dreamers. Their potential was stolen. Their lives were reduced to names in a ledger, photographs in a police file, brief mentions in news articles about a monster. They deserved better. They deserved to be seen, to be valued, to be protected. And society failed them. There's a park in Lahore now, small and modest, that was dedicated to the memory of street children who have lost their lives to violence and neglect. It doesn't specifically mention Javed Iqbal or his victims, but it's understood to be a memorial to them among others. There's a plaque that reads in Urdu and English, "Every child matters. Every life has value." It's a simple message, but one that feels necessary in a country where too many children are still invisible, still vulnerable, still at risk. The case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how societies function, about who we choose to see and who we choose to ignore. Street children weren't invisible because they were literally impossible to see. They were everywhere in markets, at traffic lights, sleeping in doorways. They were invisible because people chose not to see them, chose to look away, chose to treat them as a problem to be avoided rather than as children who needed help. And in that invisibility, Javed Iqbal found opportunity. If there's anything to be learned from this horror, it's that marginalized populations need protection, not abandonment. That early warning signs of predatory behavior need to be taken seriously, not dismissed because of incompetence or corruption. That mental health matters, that trauma matters, that how we treat the vulnerable says everything about who we are as a society. These lessons seem obvious, but they're worth repeating because variations of this story continue to play out around the world. Different countries, different victims, different predators, but the same fundamental failures. The monster of Lahore is dead now, buried and forgotten except as a cautionary tale. But the children he killed are not forgotten, not by their families, not by those who worked on the case, not by a nation that was forced to look at itself and see something very ugly reflected back. Their names are recorded, their faces are remembered. And the hope, however small, is that by telling their story, by refusing to let them disappear completely the way Javed Iqbal tried to make them disappear, we honor their memory and maybe, just maybe, we prevent future tragedies. In the end, this isn't just a story about a serial killer. It's a story about society, about justice, about the value we place on human life. It's about 100 boys who deserved better than they got, who deserved safety and love and the chance to simply exist. And it's a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it lives in an ordinary house on an ordinary street, hiding behind a facade of normalcy until the day a letter arrives and the truth spills out like acid, burning away any illusion that we live in a world where children are always safe, always valued, always seen. The families still remember every birthday that will never be celebrated, every milestone that will never be reached, every prayer that remains unanswered. They carry the weight of loss that no human should have to carry. And we, removed from their pain but connected to their humanity, carry the responsibility to remember their children, to speak their names, and to do better. If you know a child who needs help, reach out. If you see vulnerability being exploited, say something. If you have the means to support organizations that work with street children, displaced youth, or victims of abuse, consider giving. These stories don't have to keep repeating. Change is possible. It's difficult, it's slow, but it's possible. And it starts with refusing to look away from those whom society has rendered invisible. The 100 boys of Lahore are gone, but they are not forgotten. May they rest in peace. May their families find some measure of comfort. And may we all work toward a world where no child is so forgotten, so invisible, that a monster can steal their life and no one even notices they're gone.